Hey everybody, Gregg Bendian at TheProgCast, and I'm here for part two of what has become a very fascinating and enjoyable conversation with Trey Gunn. How you doing, Trey?
I'm good.
Good. Yeah, we got into some stuff last time, and I wanted to continue sort of where we left off. And I'm very
Let's see if we
fast.
can keep it to two parts.
Okay, the gauntlet has been thrown, folks. Uh, right. Andy Partridge is the only guy who has three parts. So there you go. The gauntlet has been thrown. Um, I'm fascinated by touch instruments and being a percussionist, more than occasionally have used a guitar to do what I can do with my hands, fingers, and or implements to get sounds out of those strings, and almost like a hammered dulcimer.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I just wondered, like, how is that coming from keyboard for you? How is it working in your musical brain?
Yeah. Um, it's a little. I'm going back to when I first encountered. I first was drawn to the instrument, the Chapman stick. Interestingly, I mean, I had heard, of course, Crimson's Discipline record with Tony Levin playing it, and the instrument sticks out
No pun
much more
intended.
than it. I wouldn't say it doesn't stick out on the couple of Gabriel records I'd heard earlier, but it was about Peter and Peter's vibe, But with that Discipline record, the opening of Elephant Talk, or I don't know, it's all over the record. Um, and of course, when we went to transcribe it, it's more on there than I thought. But of course, I'd heard that, and it was a fascinating instrument, and I had been a bass player for most of my playing. But the thing that really drew me to the instrument was originally the tuning, which was a fifth space tuning. The low strings were tuned an octave below a cello, and I had this hunch that the reason why the guitar, not so much the bass, but when I played guitar, I felt this kind of blues breathing on the back of my neck the whole time. That was great for a lot of players, but just did not fit me. My hands just kind of went to these idiomatic things that had this blues flavor that I didn't like, and the way I've described it before, it's like Eric Clapton's just leaning over, breathing on my neck a little more than fits me personally. And I wondered about this tuning, this fifth space tuning. And then, so I was wanting to explore that with this instrument. And that's when I met Robert Fripp. And he showed this tuning that he was using on the guitar that was fifth space based on a low C. And as soon as I put that on my guitar, I was like, okay, I was right about this force thing. And I got a little distracted playing the guitar for a while, so I didn't get to the Chapman stick till a little bit later. But more to your question, when I first put it on, and actually Robert lent me one of his, he had a stick from like 76, and I don't think the strings have been changed in 10 years. When I first put it on, and it is a putting it on. The stick is like, it's like you're putting a jousting suit on, like you're getting into a thing and it's tied to your belt and it's wrapped around, and you're it's like scuba gear or something. Um, when I first started to play around, of course I didn't know what I was doing or anything. And my sense was, it was like everything I'd been trying to do on a keyboard or a guitar or a bass all wrapped up in one. Like I had already been kind of partway down a pathway, but all on the wrong instrument. And now here's the right instrument for doing these things. And so it was really a combination of all of those things. I hadn't done much percussion and didn't really even get into percussion until decades later. But of course, you have this sense of that it's an attack. You know, the drum, it just takes one motion, right? Whereas guitars, there's a fretting and then a motion. So that's kind of how it was for me. It was a little bit of these three angles of the keyboards, the bass, and the guitar coming together with this technique that was kind of evolved isn't the right word, but it was really a hybrid way of playing. That these weren't the right instruments. That this now was the right instrument. This approach.
Well, let me be a little nerdy as usual,
it.
and just ask, in terms of finger usage, in terms of finger
Yeah.
placement, are there proper techniques? Do people develop their own ways of dealing with the instrument? Is it a more open-ended instrument or experimental, or is it really just like you have to think of it this way and work with it this way with your 10 fingers?
Yeah, awesome question. Not a simple answer. You know, one of the yes and no. Okay, but I'll give you the argument for both sides. It's a little bit like the argument: should you learn what you're doing or should you not learn? A little bit. You know what I mean? Through my whole time of like learning to play it and playing it on records, there was really no technical background of how to play the thing. A lot of stick players would disagree, but that was my take. That if you wanted to play the piano, there's 300 years of pedagogy, and you just need to pick your path, you know. And for this instrument, there wasn't, and of course, guitar there wasn't too much, but there is classical guitar tradition, and you know, there's the instrument had been around a while, but this was so new. And so for many years, I would even say a decade or more, I was trying to figure out the best way to play it and get a good sound. And there are some technical challenges with the instrument that you don't have on other instruments. It looks like a guitar or a bass. So bass players and guitar players go to the approach the instrument like their instrument. And I'll give you, without going crazy, but I'll give you one example, is that we're used to reaching for a fret and holding it down, and so spreading out the hands to get to a note is no big deal. I mean, okay, it's a physical challenge to be able to be fluid and get to it, but reaching out to a note and holding it down, or holding multiple notes at a time in a you know, a splayed position. But that's even more complicated. Let's just say playing a note, reaching out and grabbing that note down there is no big deal. For our instrument, it's a big deal. You don't want to do that. You actually want to keep your fingers and your hands really relaxed and move to the note. So if I want a note down here, I move the whole hand.
So talk to me about attack, though.
Okay, I'll get you there.
Okay.
So, and this is really important. And I was kind of doing it instinctively to a degree until I spent a lot of time with Marcus Reuter, who's kind of delved into the technique. He came a little bit after me, but he spent a lot more time working on the technique, and he's kind of codified this a little bit more than me. But the way we look at it is there are no positions on the instrument like guitar or cello. There's third position, there's fifth position, there's seventh position. We don't do that. We move everywhere. So you can play a scale with any combinations of notes going up and down the string because you have this. And the reason is you don't want this, because it's a shitty attack. It's not a clean attack. You can't do it relaxed if you're out here. Now, and this gets into I'll try not to veer into derogatory territory, but this gets into the kind of playing that doesn't work for me on the instrument, which is all the notes are either equal in volume or uneven in tone because of this tension. And it's like you're hitting, yeah, it just doesn't sound good if you're not relaxed. Let's put it like that. And one of the challenges of our instrument is to, well, one of them, being super nerdy, is descending legato, because you need to clear the full string for every note, unless you're doing pull offs. And the thing that guitar players get away with is they use a lot of gain and they use a lot of compression. You can't actually hear the super clean, like be able to play it. If you ask a lot of these guys to play super with a super clean sound and no compression, you're going to hear the unevenness. But of course, with gain, you don't. Descending descending legato lines is the challenge, because you need to actually clear the whole string before you put a new fret down. And so ascending is not that big a deal. Anyway, that's one thing. So back to the attack. Yeah, the thing that we discovered, well, the thing that I discovered very intuitively, very early on, and which Marcus has even codified a little bit more, is the release is the most important part. It's not the attack. If all you focus on is the attack, a couple of things happen. You don't have a sense of the end of your note. And of course, that's one of the things that I think most of us can agree. Tony Levin's got magic feel in hands. And a lot of it is because he's so in touch with where the end of the note is in the groove, from my perspective. And so if you're just focusing on the attack, or if you're thinking, now I'm probably going to misrepresent drumming or good drumming, but if you're only thinking about the attack like a drummer might, I don't know if they do or not. You can clarify me. You're missing. You're missing. Like if
Well,
you're,
okay, you've hit a
yeah,
nail on the head, because it is the thing that I have to say to every sound person I ever deal with is it's attack and tone.
yeah,
Please
yeah.
don't
And
just
the
focus on
ring means something,
and
right?
and so when you hear decay,
Hmm.
that's okay. You know, some drummers actually like to have a pitch and a ringing sound on the toms. Not everybody's going to tape stuff down and put on gels and everything. So just be ready for that, that it's also about tone. And I think that's what you're speaking of. And tone is so much beyond attack.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So we practice a lot, and I started doing it fairly early on, but working with Marcus quite a bit, practicing the release. Even with a metronome, so that you can release every note when you want. Is it an eighth note release? Is it a whole note release? Is it a whole note but you're releasing on the third beat, the and of three? You want control of that, and part of that also comes. What comes with that too is, if all your concern is the attack, you're accumulating attention. You're accumulating tension with every attack. Whereas if you're if you attack, and even while you're holding it, you release, and I'm not talking about releasing the note, but you're releasing the tension while you're holding the note, and then you release, you're able to just play really relaxed. I mean, that's what relaxed is on our instrument. Is you make the attack, you let the energy go. You need more energy to make the attack than you do to hold the note. So you need to let that go. And then when you let the note go, that's when the pitch goes. There's your short little, but maybe you have more questions. I don't know.
Well, I mean, watching you play the war guitar, um, this was going back to Construction of Light and that week of shows that we did. I was very interested in what you were doing, and um, I was interested in your pedal setup and what you were using at that time. And I think we had a talk about it on stage during sound check one time. But you also reminded me of cello at
Mm,
times. It put me in the mind of cello, particularly with your use of volume pedal on things like
mm,
Fractured.
mhm.
So I guess I wondered, what's the extended, then what becomes the moving beyond the stick into the other instruments and your sound world that's beyond, say, the Tony Levin sound world.
Yeah, so I guess I mean the first thing for me was I took the top side of the instrument very seriously, as opposed to in contrast to I mean you have your traditional playing traditional way that some stick players played coming from Emmett Chapman, where it's a whole it's like a solo pianist and you're doing melodies and chords and you have that way of playing. And I think it only took me about 2 weeks on the instrument to realize that was never going to work for me. That I just I wasn't interested in it. Um, I wasn't. I wouldn't say I wasn't going to be able to do it, but I wasn't going to be able to be very good at it, and it seemed like a waste of resources, to be honest. Like it seemed like a waste of the instrument for me. Um, to
What's
to
the highest no, I'm sorry to interrupt.
yeah,
What's the highest pitch on that stick?
on mine is a C. I don't know what to say. It's as high as a guitar at the 24th fret.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. Yeah.
That would be an E. Yeah, it might even be higher. Yeah, I'm looking down here to refresh myself. Yeah. So I took the top side of the instrument seriously because it was always kind of a place where traditionally you just kind of played the melody and then did a solo, or kind of Tony Levin's way of using it, at least at the time back in the 80s and 90s, was kind of a supportive integrated into the bass part. And so I ended up with a few gigs when I was living in New York playing with a bass player. And so I just stayed out of the bass range and I experimented with the top range. And that kind of opened up, well, it totally opened up the instrument for me. Forget the bass. Let's just have two hands and forget separating the hands into bass and guitar, which I'll be honest, to me it seems really absurd that you could play, sure, you can play two parts, but to play the role of a bass player and a role of the soloist at the same time feels musically ignorant or something, like it's a different mindset. The instrument's already hard enough, and now you're going to say, I'm going to do, I'm going to play two completely different musical roles at the same time.
It's like a circus trick.
Yeah, it's a circus trick and not great in my opinion. I mean, there are guys who are really good at it,
Mhm.
but it wasn't ever going to be my thing. So I kind of gravitated to finding interesting textural things with the top side of the instrument, these swells, or kind of like playing a clavinet was something that I really liked, and then eventually got into approaching it as the solo instrument, leave the bass behind, work with another instrumentalist who could play the bass part. Sometimes that's a war guitar, sometimes another war guitar, sometimes it's a bass player. Pat and I had this project with Chemo accordionist in Finland who also had like MIDI bass, so I could solo and he could play MIDI bass. And
Hmm.
yeah,
Yeah, I've seen through a very talented student at the university the advanced accordion situation, and that's pretty fascinating with the MIDI accordions now.
yeah, it's crazy. And Chemo plays the Finnish accordion, which has only buttons. It's insane.
It's another definition of a touch instrument,
Exactly, exactly.
pressing them buttons. So one of the things that I find interesting about you and about your involvement with kind of different wings of what we call progressive music, I guess. And when we met, I remember that I gave you bone structure CD that I had done with G. Stinson and Jeff Gote and Stuart Liebig. And it was very much the kind of ethos that was happening in the so-called projects of Crimson, that there are going to be groupings and there's going to be openness and things are going to happen and maybe we won't use all of them. This sort of goes back to Weather Report, actually, where according to Bob Belden's, Alan said, take out all the shit that's not happening. So I remember giving you that, and you gave me the joy of molybdenum, if I said that right.
Yeah.
And that to me was also very cool because I sensed Middle Eastern influences in there as well. And I'm very interested in Dumbek and Armenian and Turkish music. So, I mean, can you tell me a little bit about that world that you inhabit?
Yeah, so I mean, I've always been interested in the East in Indian music and Arabic music, and but a lot of that in practice for this record that you're talking about came from meeting this percussionist Bob Muller, who I worked with in New York, and I remember seeing Bob, and I can't remember the group now what it was called, but it was a very early Knitting Factory show, and it was him, Chris Cunningham, who's a stick player, and Carter Burwell, the film composer who went on to do all the Coen Brothers films.
Yeah.
He was playing accordion, I believe, and Bob was playing tabla. And I don't remember this that well, but Bob said he was packing up, and this big Texan guy came up to him and said, I play stick, I must play with you. And so he was like, okay, sure. So we got together at his little studio underneath the Catholic Church in the East Village and played just tabla and stick. And what a great sound. It was such an awesome sound. It was a whole rhythm section because of the low on the tabla and the snap and then my instrument. And we just kind of grew that sound out. This is interesting, you maybe know this already, I don't know, but we thought, well, it's a cool sound, but we need another player. I can't do the whole thing on my own. It doesn't quite work. So we auditioned some players, and Dave Douglas answered our ad and came down and played with us. And what a sound that was. So anyway, Bob and I eventually formed a band with more players, and he had the tabla, and he had the tabla knowledge much more than I did. So he was teaching me stuff, and we were learning T-highs and stuff, and then the Dumbek and the Bendir, and so that was a big influence, and it kind of came to full fruition with the Joy of Molybdenum record and the tours that we did, where we just really explored that stuff. And one of the things that was really cool was I was always looking, I feel like this doesn't bother me as much now, but it used to, the drum kit just seemed old-fashioned, or it grew out of rock. I know it didn't grow out of rock and roll, but for me it did. And the kick on the one and the snare on the backbeat, at the time at least, it just didn't fit the kind of rhythms that I wanted to play, because you could play in 7, you could play in 11 or 13, but if you're still using those instruments in that function, I mean, that's one way of going, and I've done that, and it is cool, but it just was kind of, it wasn't loosening up the instrumentation. It was still like a drummer thinking like Bad Company or Black Sabbath. They were just modifying it, And so what was so cool about this hand percussion that Bob was doing is we just let that go. And what we did instead was, like, on some of the tracks, he would be playing drum kit, and there would be an overdub of the tabla or the bendir, but we would do it in the reverse order. So we'd do the basic track with the bendir, and then he would go in and play the drums. And because you've already got this full grooving sound, the drum part ended up the one that worked was when it was more abstracted and you weren't trying to hold everything down.
Well,
In
you're
fact,
talking about like an interesting concept that comes up early in the Gabriel and the Kate Bush stuff, which
yeah,
is no cymbals.
yeah,
So
yeah,
that's big because there's no
yeah,
white noise being generated necessarily. And we all know about that. So
yeah,
once you eliminate that and now you're into a different world of colors and you can orchestrate from that, I get it. I just did a record with Tim Motzer where I didn't play any drum set. It was all orchestral percussion.
right.
So the idea of like not allowing the drum kit into
Yeah.
your thing
Well,
while you're
I feel like, and you would know this better than me, but I feel like now in the 2020s, drummers have had so much more experience doing that. It's in the rhythmic vocabulary to not be hemmed down to essentially 1960s drumming with modern sound. You know what I mean? Like
oh yeah.
it's the vocabulary is a lot wider. And it's hard for me not to, as we're talking about this, think about Stuart Copeland because he did do this with the drum kit at a time when nobody else really was. And they sounded like a group. They still sounded like a rock group, even though when I saw them play, he would stop playing the kick drum for 8 bars. And then when you bring it in, and it's not that giant kick drum, but it's just man, it really has meaning. It's not something that everybody's leaning on musically.
It all goes back to orchestration, I think. You imagine the sound world, what it contains, and you also imagine what it does not contain. I think
Mm-hmm.
that for me is like choose your forces. And so limiting to, all I'll have is like a concert bass drum, but I'm not
Mm.
going to be banging on that thing all day.
No,
So
it's huge.
so you want it when you need it
Mm-hmm.
and place it and it has some meaning. And yeah, I like to think of that. I mean, also soundtracks are really interesting for the non-drum set thing. And of
Mm-hmm.
course, all the great percussion writers like Xenakis and Perez. And when you hear percussion as an independent voice rather than as a, I don't know, backdrop.
Supportive. Yeah.
Yeah. But did I see Bob play Dumbeck with Happy Roads at the Bottom
Yes.
Line?
Yeah. Yeah.
He's great.
Yeah.
Great,
Yeah.
great player. Great
And
player.
the biggest challenge Bob had was when we went to go play live. How do you do this? Because how do you play the drum kit and tabla at the same time? Early on we tried kind of like he was kind of a modified tree lock setup,
Right.
cross-legged on the ground with electronic kick drum underneath one knee. But that wasn't enough. So he ended up making this hybrid kit where he bought snare stands and put the tabla over here. And he's wearing the Dumbeck or the Bandier with the microphone, and then here's the drum kit. So you kind of get some layers, which the music really needed that. It needed those colors and it needed those feels. Otherwise, you're just kind of back to a rock, a little bit more of a rock vibe than I wanted at the time.
It's really funny. Yeah, what you don't want it to be. It really does come
And of
up.
course, we couldn't afford to have 3 percussionists with us. That was impossible. Just taking that drum kit to Mexico City for a couple of shows was a nightmare. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and we always have gear issues. But yeah, I played a lot of hybrid kits with Derek Bailey. My kit was hybrid, and also have done like with Richard Leo Johnson when we played opening for you guys. It was a hybrid kind of thing. I
Hmm.
couldn't fit my bass drum. I wasn't allowed to have a bass drum because they'd have to move Adrian's pedal board. So this guy who was doing my back line said, "I'll get you a trigger." And he just got me this little trigger and it would go boom, boom. And there were 100 samples of bass drums, and the 100th one was the only one that
Was the
sounded
one.
useful.
Jeez, jeez.
But
This
yeah,
is also reminding me of when I saw David Van Tighem with Laurie Anderson back in the day.
right.
He was
He's big for
standing
me.
up.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was really cool. And of course, she didn't need or want the traditional groove. You know, she wanted the energy and the strangeness.
Well, I mean, that's back to Jamie Muir, man. I mean,
Yeah.
it's really interesting when or Guillermo Franco with McCoy when I saw him come up with a stop sign and just start shaking the stop sign and yeah, he played the shit out of that stop sign.
Mm-hmm.
And that whole world of percussion was huge for me coming up to think, oh, we don't have to just play drum set.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking about your earlier comment about the duration of notes, the release of notes, and the only thing that I could really compare it to was timpani.
Mm-hmm.
Properly compare it to. It's
Mm-hmm.
like what we have to do with timpani with dampening and then letting things ring and then how long notes are and what how kind of tuning affects your decay.
Yeah, and you got to
Really,
keep track of the pitches, right? You can't have the pitches overlap. It doesn't mean the same thing.
right. Rarely will you have pitches overlap. Rarely will you have two drum playing. It happens, but it's
Mm-hmm.
that kind of idea. Like we have four strings
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
they all have pedal tuning.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of cool that way. And playing, I did it with bass players, and I did it with an upright bass player in one of Ornette Coleman's groups. And so it was really kind of funny because, you know, I'm trying to find my register the way you are finding your register when you're playing with a bass player. Like, do you
Mm-hmm.
both want to, you don't want to both be in the same register
Not really. Not really.
unless what there's something you want to reinforce, but honestly,
Well, you wouldn't want that to be the ground that you grow out from. You want it to be a special flavor, right?
yeah.
I think my take on it.
What what is the you strike me as a very thoughtful person, as someone who's reaching for fulfillment in a lot of different ways and self-improvement. What is your sort of routine? What is your musical life like? Best case scenario for you?
Um, it's interesting. Those are two different questions. Let me talk about my ideal
Okay.
routine. You know, I'm recently moved to New Mexico, so I'm building kind of a new life, which is great. I like writing music in the morning and practicing in the morning, maybe up through the day. Um, and I'm doing a lot of writing and kind of producing, recording right now. And then somewhere in the late afternoon, I go do jujitsu, and that's my. I almost feel like I could live without music for a week or two, but I couldn't do that without jujitsu.
Every
My
day?
body, not every day because I have to recover, but like 4 or 5 days a week. Yeah, yeah.
For how long have you done this?
Um, Maybe 7 or 8 years, and then Aikido 11-ish years before that. But it's really, really, it seems to be very important to me. My body gets depressed when I'm on the road, and I don't get to do it. You know, there's other challenges, and I don't tour as much as I used to. But I did a month of shows with Pat and Marcus in August, and we're going to do about the same in May. And that's a long time for me, and a long time without jujitsu. I don't like it.
Do you ever go try to hit the hotel gym? Do tread?
Yeah, I do stretching, and I have some on some occasions I picked up like going to a local jujitsu school. Um,
No.
Usually it's when I'm in rehearsal, so I know if something happens, I can recover. um, I've been tracking the Tool guys, and Maynard is a black belt in jiu-jitsu now. And the last two were he did jiu-jitsu every single day. He would either went into somebody's gym or he brought in the badass guy who's in town that day.
Wow.
And they have a training. He has like a training facility backstage. Obviously, a different scale than playing some of the crappy clubs I play, but
I just
yeah.
saw them actually at Madison Square Garden.
So he had
Yeah.
he had John Danaher and I think Brian Glick, who John's, well, no, John would have been in LA. He had Brian Glick, who was John Danaher's, one of his black belts in New York, top guy, come into his little backstage gym and train with him before the show.
Well, I feel routine is important. I mean, I feel if you like, if I have to go to the gym or I'm not going to make it. So I know exactly what you're talking about, particularly playing physical music like the Mahavishnu stuff. You know, you have to, you got to go, you've got to be physical.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know, we're not getting younger, but
No,
it's important to, you know, upkeep is important. And I like that it just makes you healthier, you know, to be
yeah,
active
yeah,
and the
yeah.
brain works better.
Yeah, and to that point, the kind of aphorism I always think is you've got to be a white belt in something. You know, like all the time, you should have something that you're not very good at that's new to you, that's stretching you, whether it's language or
Hmm.
sports or some kind of physical thing or chess or whatever. You know, like to for me now at this point, it makes sense. I would never think this when I was younger, because of course, you know, you want to practice 12 hours a day and try to be better than anybody who's ever played the drums before on the planet. Now at this point, you're like, no, 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 that isn't it at all. But the most interesting people are the ones who have, I think, some breadth. You know, they're interested in other things than just that thing. For me, you know, and I'm sure
Well,
there's lots of different examples of the opposite of that, but that's how I look at it.
yeah, people can specialize, but
Yeah,
some people don't specialize or they generalize of a special area,
yeah,
sort of
yeah.
like what you and I do. You know, we specialize in this sort of area of new music, creating new things, looking to see maybe some things that didn't get done before.
Mm.
It was interesting to me that you know, the idea of progressive music, if you haven't been paying attention for 50 years, you realize just how many different wings there are and how many were available to us in our years. And we're at this point where we can choose freely.
Mm,
And
mm,
there and we can self-produce anything we want now.
mm.
So
Yeah, nobody
what's
has to give you permission anymore.
no, no one, there's no gatekeeper.
Hmm.
So so what is your ideal music that you're working on now? What do you have up your sleeve?
You know, ideal is not not something how I think about it. Just in terms of I kind of give myself a challenge and then I deal with that, and then I pick another challenge. So there's no, it's just whatever I've challenged myself. And the current challenge is I've been working on compositions that are using just my instrument as the,
Multiple?
yeah, yeah. As if I kind of started it like, what if you had a string quartet of touch instruments? What would I do? And funny enough, when I started that, I ended up doing 2 days of improvisation solo without overdubs, and that's where that led me. But then I returned back to it, and so I've been working on that for many years now, like 6 years. And I kind of spend a couple of months on it, and then I'm off on something else, and I keep returning to these compositions. And there's that challenge of just using this instrument, and then and the one of the challenges of that and so just this instrument and their compositions, there's nothing improvised, because I'm such an improviser. I can always let's be, if I'm a little bit derogatory, I can always leave the composition unfinished, and my improv chops will solve the musical story. And so this time I wanted to not have that as a crutch, and that I really got to go in and decide every single note
Mhm.
beforehand. And so and it seemed like a doable challenge. And I thought I knew what the challenges were, but not until I got into it deeply have I figured out that the challenges are much more complex than I thought. One is if you don't have a drummer that you're leaning on for momentum, you've got to make the momentum. And then the question is, how do you want to make the momentum? And there's some obvious ways that people have done, and do I want to lean on those or do I want to find new ones? And hopefully I'm finding new ones. But every time I come back to the project, I'm realizing, oh, I can do that better. There's that, and so what I've done was compose. I have a pretty thorough composition process now where I'm writing away from the instrument.
Yeah.
I've made sample libraries of my instrument, and I'm using sample libraries to make the composition. But then I have to go in and play it,
Yep.
and it's fucking hard
I know
because
that one.
it's not made from things that I do on the instrument. It's lines and rhythms, and the way I've constructed the momentum is not what I would do as a player at all.
Well, can I just jump in and say
Yeah,
that anybody composing probably shouldn't be composing on their instrument?
I agree with that
I,
100%.
I kind of went there because not even for the challenge. It was just like, am I really thinking about what the music is, or am I thinking about what I can play?
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
my imagination would take me places where I'd write some shit and I'd go, oh, I got to practice that. That's hard.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Well, it's a slower process,
Hmm.
and the quickest process is you get together and you improvise on stage. That's the quickest one, right? Like no rehearsal, no band discussions, no, you just go on stage and play, and then backing up from that is you have rehearsals, and then you have things, and then the deepest is composition, and you've got to play these notes, so you've got to freaking rehearse it if you want to be any good. So it's a much slower process, and I'm finding it awesome, but very, very challenging. Yeah.
I've just found as I've gotten older, slowing things down is not necessarily a bad thing, because how much fast music can you play in your
Yeah.
life
Yeah. Yeah.
and ignore a different perception of time,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And it's
Mm-hmm.
funny too, because it just sprung to mind that Stravinsky conducting his works at the end of his life, everything was so much slower tempo
Mm-hmm.
wise.
Mm-hmm.
And people criticized this.
He probably wanted to savor every note.
He probably did,
Yeah.
and the one note, when it's the right note, followed by the next note that's the right note, that is something to savor, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I think ideally, uh, every note is the right note. And we challenge ourselves. Can I do it spontaneously? But when you're like Metheny says, uh, composition, improvisation, they're the same thing. There's just a difference in temperature,
Mm-hmm.
and so, yeah, controlling every note on the page. That's one way of getting really, really deeply into the music. Is that, like I said in the last time we chatted, is that a note or a piece of dirt? You know,
Well,
did you mean that note?
it definitely forces you to make decisions that you either put off or don't even really look at. I'm gonna improvise in five in A minor. It's gonna work out just fine. Well, okay, look, what note am I starting on this phrase? What note am I ending on? What beat am I ending on? Why? Or at least So it's been fascinating for me to just kind of confront my taste at a a really forcing it level, and yeah, it's great.
It's so great to talk to you, Trey. I could go on and on, but before we split, I wanted to do something fun with you, which
Let's
is
have fun.
okay. So I'm going to ask you, and you can take it in any order you want, but early, middle, late periods of King Crimson, what is your favorite stuff? And I guess take it from there.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if this counts as early, but the track Red, is that early? Early enough?
No.
I don't know that I'm a huge fan of Crimson before that.
Interesting. Yeah.
I didn't. I came to Lark's Tongues and Red after Discipline,
Wow.
and
So red connects to discipline for you somehow?
um, no, it's just an amazing. I'm talking about the piece Red, not the,
Oh,
not the whole record, but no, it's just that piece is amazing, and it's one of those pieces. And when we played it live, it has the thing that it does built into the architecture, so you can't really fuck it up, like having a bad night, because the piece still does what it does.
yeah.
Maybe not as well, but it does. In a certain way, there's kind of a perfect balance in the architecture that just works. That just works.
And it's through composed.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, not if you listen to Tony Levin play it,
Okay, point taken.
but and probably Bill didn't play it the same every night either. But yeah, the phrases are what they are, and they belong that way, and you don't mess with it. Although we did have to mess with it once. We played a show with the double trio in Italy on the Adriatic coast up in the north
Mm.
outside, and we played it as an encore. And the wind and the storm came up, and the sound man came out in the middle of Red in the encore and said, or maybe he told us before, I may have to pull you guys.
Yeah.
And he came out in the middle of the first third where it's still rocking, it hasn't gone to the middle section. He's like, duh. And suddenly Tony looked over. We all had the same thought. Tony looked over and was like, cut to the end. And we just did like a 65-second version, but it was still the form because the end and the beginning were
Yes.
there. So, so that was pretty cool.
That's
That we
very cool.
honored the shape, but cut a lot of it. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned red because now when I think of red to discipline, when the discipline band and the record came out and they played at my college gym in 82, they played red. And
Mm.
that was like, yeah, in case you were wondering, here's a calling
Correct. Yeah.
card.
That's probably the only thing. Or maybe they were doing Larks too.
They were doing Larks too, but they were
Yeah.
doing red and Larks too. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would probably put Larks too in that, but I played it so much that it just doesn't mean the same. It doesn't quite mean the same to me.
But the different versions, can you talk
Yeah.
a little bit about that? Is there much change in Larks too?
That's one that you can wreck it
Mm.
for some reason. I don't know why. Maybe the structure is a little more fragile. Not wreck it, but it can just be kind of like, oh, okay, we're doing that again. Uh, Whereas Red, it never felt like that to me. And then, of course, the thing about the Larks is the themes kept coming back, and they came back during my time too. So we have Larks 4, which Pat and Marcus and I play in our trio now, which is really fun. Fun to revisit it.
Well, I
So
remember, wasn't that on Construction of Light?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
I got
yeah.
the joke immediately when it happened. I remember that. It's like, oh, didn't the discipline band have a 3? Okay, here's 4. Yeah,
Exactly.
that's fun.
Middle period, probably frame by frame. I guess if we call that middle period, I guess we would have to call that, yeah. And then late period, which would be with me, probably the track level 5 is heavy and has a similar architecture like Red that kind of works. Um, it works. Larks 4 does as well, but it's a little. I don't know. It's different. It's looking back a little bit, whereas level 5 feels like even now it's still kind of looking forward.
It's such a great piece, and I've seen Stickmen do it, and I've seen the giant group do it. What's the process that's happening when you're putting together Larks for?
Yeah, it's long, laborious, meticulous. Um, a lot of exploration, a lot of dead ends, a lot of Robert will bring this thing in and then we'll mess around with it for a week or 3 years. And when it gets close to, and then this other thing, and does it work with this, and we need to try that, and it's like you have to kind of try everything. At least with that band, you need to try. Sometimes things came together relatively quickly, but that's only in relation to the stuff that just took forever to try to figure out if is this the right form? Should this be 6 times or 7 times, and then should we go to this? Should this be in this key or should it be in this key? You got to try it. You just got to try it. There's not a singular vision of somebody coming in and saying this is how it goes. So it's kind of like Robert sets the blocks in motion, and if we chew on them in a way that everybody feels like it's alive, then we just kind of keep chewing until the form emerges. Is kind of, yeah. So it's a slow group process, highly valuable and highly effective. But it kind of required a luxury of time that most musicians don't get the chance to be in. At least in my experience.
Was that a month in Adrian's studio putting that record together?
The record, yeah, yeah. The construction of light, yeah, yeah.
But
And
before that, the process is what?
well, the construction of light was very unusual because the music wasn't played live before we recorded it, which meant it probably was more than a month. It was probably like 3 months or something like that because you haven't embodied it enough to know what's right until you record a version, listen to it, and see, ah, shit, it's 4 clicks too slow, and that section should be in the other key, and I don't like how there's 6 of these phrases. There should be 5 here.
Well, it creates objectivity, and also you're sort of now your editing phase.
Well, except we recorded it on ADATs, so there was no Pro Tools editing.
Right, 2000.
So we had to do it. You had to do it again. In contrast, the Thrack record was pretty much recorded in a week because we had played the stuff live for a month in Argentina. We'd sorted out all this stuff. You do 2 takes. There isn't really, maybe 3, but there's nothing to improve on the general thing. You found it. Maybe there's little overdubs in the vocals and this and that, but. The construction of light was a slower process.
I remember the process going on a little bit in sound checks
I bet you
week,
did.
only because it was fascinating to me that it was clear some of these things like Fractured were coming from Robert's guitar parts, but you and Pat had to decide to what degree are you rhythm section, to what degree are you reinforcing, to what degrees are you going against? And
Hmm.
that was fun to watch.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
changed things too. I remember because I heard him
yeah.
later and like, Oh, that's not on the original, you know?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's kind of what's cool about doing the record that way is that you can, when you go out on the road, you can say, this is how it should be. Or this week, let's do it like this. You know what? I don't like that we were playing with Robert. Let's play a slow three underneath, or something. And, sometimes that'll work for a while and then that'll start to be not the right way to do it. But yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And did you think of that role as being a big part of the job? Was you and Pat coming up with this foundational stuff for what was going to go on top?
Usually it was the other way. Usually the guitar players found their parts and fixed themselves to their parts and wouldn't change, even if Pat and I were begging them to.
Uh,
So it's a little bit. I'm going to say that I'm going to pull that back a little bit. That's on a couple of the tunes that weren't as great of tunes as some of the ones where it's really obvious that we're all doing the right thing. Um, we often would, well, when we were recording The Power to Believe, we went in on a couple of tunes and Pat and I thought we knew that we'd found the right thing to go with Robert and Adrian's part. And once we laid down the tracks, we are like, no, doesn't work. We're all just in the same vibe. It needs a counter line. So we just wiped our parts and started from scratch and did something very different. So generally, the bass and drum parts were not the ground that the piece grew out of. It was the opposite way.
yeah, that's very interesting because it probably changes for every period, every band,
Probably.
right?
Yeah, yeah.
Because we tried this, let's try that.
Yeah,
And
and this is with the kind of tight compositions. Going back to our example, our earlier talk about you shouldn't write on your instrument. The thing about writing on your instrument is you can come up with a cool thing that nobody does on that instrument, and then you take that and make it into something away from the instrument. And Crimson would do that too. I mean, I'm sure that's how Elephant Talk appeared. Um,
Sheltering
Shelter
Sky.
Sky, yeah.
Mm.
And I think we must have examples of that, but where we came up with something and it was able to be go through the Crimson blender enough to fit with the Crimson. But that's a very different process than how do you make Larks 4?
And the fact that there are multiple processes being employed in a mobile intelligent unit has always been of interest to me
Yeah,
and guys
yeah.
like me. Like when it became apparent that the Wet Nera group was going to have free improvs as intros, free improvs between pieces, free improvs in the middle of things. And I felt like, well, they're listening. They got to be listening. I think Bruford admitted they were listening to Herbie Hancock M1 stuff and the Electric Miles stuff. And, that American spitting over to Britain and Britain spitting back thing that went on forever. It's so
Mm.
fascinating to me because then, did you check out any of the British so-called jazz rock scene, like groups like Soft Machine or any of those groups, Hatfield in the North? No.
No, no, I'm probably still guilty.
Well, I just think it's some of the best stuff.
Yeah,
When you're
yeah.
talking about guys like Dave Stewart dealing
Mm.
with harmony and sounds and everything, there's just some really brilliant guys there. Holdsworth, of course,
Hmm. Hmm.
which, never was he was too rock for jazz and too jazz for rock.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think it was more we would kind of put kind of these musical problems in front of ourselves and explore them. Like, how do you play an 11? How do Pat and I play an 11? What
Hmm.
are the things we can do in 11? Um, that was one. How do you deal with like we've got this thing with the guitars bouncing in
Hmm.
Hocket and or three of us bouncing in Hocket. What can we do with that? And didn't really go outside of our universe when working.
Yes. I'll tell you my favorite early
Yeah.
piece. Probably I'd have to say Fracture.
Mm, mm,
And I love John Wetton's voice, so I feel bad not
mm,
saying that it's a wet. I mean, I love Exiles. I love um Book of Saturday.
mm,
But but really the process I think I don't know if I want to call these process pieces, but if you compare something like Fracture to something like Red, it's
mm,
almost like a simpler, less challenging etude, but an etude nonetheless.
mm,
So sort of like an intermediate versus an advanced. And Robert, of course, and Anthony Garone will tell you that, Fracture is unplayable, but I remember just the vibe of it, if you want to talk about that. And then also the idea of the model that Wetton and Bruford set up as, well, what are we going to do with this
Same thing,
guitar?
because Robert doesn't tell you what to play. He just says, "This is what I'm doing. How are you going to make this work?" And that's the real creative play in it. Or that's one of them. What are they going to do? Do they play with him? Do they play with the low notes? Do they play counter line? Do they, and that's where you're kind of you're forced into, what are my musical values? What am I going to make here? In this landscape. It's not free.
No.
It's got to work. You can go any way you want, but it's got to work. you know and of course, then you even and Fracture is a great example as well. It's not just that continuous guitar line. There's a whole shape to it. So when you come back to the line, what are you going to do? Are you going to do it the same? Going to do it different? Why would you do it? And if you're thoughtful, you got to deal with all this.
Yeah. And also, it was a very good intro to, and I guess we heard this in Close to the Edge, but just the intro of polymetric stuff,
Hmm.
simultaneous groupings that didn't necessarily, uh, well, I'd say, let's say you have the faster values versus the larger, slower values going against
Hmm.
each other. And that was quite a lesson.
Yeah, yeah,
Why do you have to think of fast fives when there's a big five?
right,
Are you
right.
addressing the big five?
Hmm.
Because you'll be bringing out a line that's going to not only tie together the activity, but also show you, oh, here's all it is this one long five. And I
Hmm.
like that idea. So it's like
Hmm.
simple and complex simultaneously.
Hmm.
It's such a fun game.
And now it must be, I mean, I don't know what it's like to be a young musician, but it's kind of in the vocabulary now, isn't it?
Well, Animals as leaders and such
Yeah.
newer bands, yeah, the virtuoso guitar thing, you could easily say Robert brought to prog metal now.
Hmm.
I don't know how many of those guys are going to admit that. I've always
Right.
had my suspicions.
Yeah.
The first heavy, complicated stuff is what? I think it's
Yeah.
like, Schizoid Man. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
It's
the example you just gave, for me, it goes to, and I know it wasn't the earliest Mahavishnu, but it was my first one, was the opening track on Visions of the Emerald Beyond, where there's this rhythm, but then he brings the guitar in at the end, and then they fit together.
yeah.
Uh, and Narada Michael Walden, and that's when I was like, wait a minute, what the hell's going on here?
Hmm.
How does this work? It does work.
It's funny because pieces like that also were coming from John's arpeggiated
Yeah.
style a lot of the time, and you have to figure out groupings. And yeah, I did a whole 12-piece band playing that stuff, the whole album as a suite, and recorded it for cuneiform. And having that many forces to play that music is really, that was one of the heaviest things that I ever did,
Mm.
was to play that stuff live with the string quartet and the
Mhm.
singer and the horns, and
Oh, wow.
rearrange it in a way that they open up areas for solos that weren't, because it's a short record. I mean,
Yeah, it is.
there's
It
not a
is.
lot of blowing by purpose, because at that point they'd figured out maybe we don't go along on everything and maybe we have some singing. But
Right.
it's interesting too that those pieces had great platforms for improvisation. Funk in Five,
Hmm. Hmm.
things that were just going to give you a platform. And so it ended up being a double album and a long show. But on the way home to Earth, you really feel like you are back, heading
You've
back.
gone somewhere.
You
Yeah.
know what I mean? In free fall. Um, yeah, that's interesting that you mentioned that, because I think when Crimson and Mahavishnu are compared, and McLaughlin and Fripp are mentioned together, they do represent a kind of new level of technique.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, even Jan Hammer will say like Birds of Fire is proto metal. And it's
Hmm.
hard to argue with that for
Hmm.
73.
Hmm. Hmm.
And what year is, and Red is 75?
I don't, yeah, I think that's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
but probably recorded in 74 or something like that, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, there was an explosion right then, wasn't there?
It was a long time sort of building up. I
Mm.
think from the 60s, it was Steve Hackett calls it a collision. I think
Mm.
there was a collision. Jazz, pop, rock, Eastern,
Hmm.
classical, everything's on the table. Even if you look at like Donovan in the 60s having woodwinds on Jennifer Juniper, this idea of Baroque pop.
Mm. Mm.
That's some very sophisticated stuff. Or Jeff Beck's Love is
Well,
Blue.
would that have been the record that John Paul Jones did the arrangements on?
Yeah. Yeah. But that's so cool too, because then you see that. I mean, I'm still living. That's a Neil Young. I'm still living that dream we had, which is that it's still viable that we can find our own voices, and
Mm.
that we can actually do something fresh.
Mm.
But
Mm.
aren't you also involved with the security project?
I was, yeah, yeah. We're not really active anymore, but yeah, yeah.
Okay, so the idea, and maybe we'll leave it here, but the idea of repertoire,
Mm.
I find so interesting. All the
Yeah,
original projects I've done, but this whole other wing of my musical life is coping or dealing in some way with repertoire and
yeah,
how one approaches it.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's the double, it's a double-edged curse or something that you can do all this stuff, and then you don't have your own repertoire, and I see the look on your face. You know exactly what I'm talking about. The you if you're entirely a universe explorer, you don't have anything to lean back on except more exploration. Whereas, and that was kind of, that wasn't exactly why the security project was so appealing to me, which is this group that played the early music of Peter Gabriel and kind of
Mhm.
rethought it. It was actually neither Jerry Marotta and I thought it would work. We didn't think it would work, but when we got together, it was like, holy shit, this really works. But it was, for me, it was a chance to play some of the music that I really, really loved that I never got to play because it's unplayable in a certain way. But we were able to figure out a way to play it, partly because the technology was available to do it authentically in a way that Peter couldn't even do it at the time. But also, it was a chance to um, kind of go deeper up the food chain behind some of the pieces and look at them as he might have been looking at them when he kind of formed the idea, and say, it doesn't have to be formed this way, it could be formed this way. And for me, that was really, really great to kind of be under the hood a little bit with this music. I never played with Peter, but I'm sure if I was playing with Peter, you wouldn't be able to do that because he would be holding the vision. But here we are free to take the vision before it gets notated and maybe go slightly different. Not a jazz version or not a balalaika version, but a version where we could take the essence of the idea and maybe run our own way a little bit, and that was really great. Yeah,
Well, there's vocabulary and there's extended vocabulary. And also, I got to say, when there's meat on them bones, if
yeah,
you're looking at that material and you just say, well, look at how cool this bass thing relates to this melody, I can run with that. I got to make a bigger deal, or things that weren't perhaps accentuated in original versions. You're like, well, let me bring out that thing. So
yeah.
it becomes an arranging game, but also, I'm sure you agree that the music is eternal.
Mm,
It doesn't exist with a time code on it. It doesn't exist with an expiration date. And the best stuff holds up over 50, 60, 100, 300 years. I think that's something we have to just reckon with. And this idea of if repertoire is 30 years old, it's repertoire. If repertoire, I mean, look, Hendrix played Sergeant Pepper's on the week the album came out. It's repertoire.
yeah.
There's the current repertoire and then there's the archival historic repertoire, but nonetheless, I also find I feel I'm serving that music in a way, serving it up or just serving the message
Yeah,
of the music,
absolutely.
right?
Absolutely. Well, and it is a little, I think the strange part of it is this particular kind of, I'm just going to use the word rock, is so, one of the things that we liked about the Strong Things, they were so specific to those personalities in that band. So for the longest time, playing that music, it felt like you were missing the important ingredient. But I
Mm.
feel like now enough time has passed and enough people have kind of toyed with this that this stuff is available to play with and not feel like you're missing something.
Trey, before we wrap it up, can you talk a little bit about the scorebook series, sort of what you're thinking is coming up with that? And do you envision people going out and forming ensembles to use these books for that purpose?
Okay, so the Crimson score books started really because I met this guy Gabriel who was just a badass transcriber. He transcribed some of maybe it was the construction of life like light he first sent to me, and I thought, wow, I didn't even know this was possible.
On Sibelius?
Yes. Um, he might have just done the bass line because we had to wrestle with that one later. But so we started talking about, could we do the Thrack record? And we ended up forming a relationship and working together with him, where he would do the transcribing and I would tab everything. And so we ended up putting out Thrack, and then since then have gone back and visited the three discipline records and done all of those, pretty much every freaking note.
Yeah.
And it was a big challenge. And then our next task is the Wetton years. And in a certain way, and I wrote this in the introduction to the Thrack record, it's absurd in a certain way to transcribe Crimson because even the band didn't stick to these notes. There's the spirit of it, and you go with the spirit over the notes. Otherwise, it starts to fall hollow. In my experience, being in the band, except for a tune like Red. So I didn't, but still, it was kind of a cool thing to have the notes and to look and see what actually was there. And we've pretty much stuck to the studio recordings. We reference the live recordings mostly for the tabs and how things were played. because obviously with the recordings, you can't tell what the hell Adrian's doing, but so it wasn't, and then it just seemed like a really good thing to have a record, a resource. And in fact, even one of the times I was playing with Tony and Adrian in the Crimson Project, we pulled out Thrack because there was an argument about, which was totally typical of Crimson. The first time I played with Tony and Pat and Bill and Robert was at Bill's house. Adrian wasn't there, and they got in an argument about the form of red. And Pat was the one who had the answer. But it was interesting that we had to use the Thrack book to pull it out. Like, well, was it 4 bars here, or
Yeah,
did
yeah.
the melody start? So the idea of bands going out and playing this stuff, it never occurred to me. But of course, obviously they would, or the I mean, how cool is it to actually have a resource now that you could not just noodle around on your own, but have repertoire, or have
Yes.
at least a starting point. And how I would probably look at it is more, maybe it would be cool to play a couple of the tunes with your band, but how cool would it be to go in and grab some things and run with them, knowing the like you've gone to the library and you checked out the source material,
Yeah.
and you started with the same firmament and ran with it. That's how I would look at it. But of course, if you want to play some of this stuff authentically, whatever that means, there it is.
And where can people buy these?
We sell them on the 7dmedia.com website there, and also we have a 7D Bandcamp site. And Burning Shed now carries them in Europe. One of the big challenges for this stuff is that shipping, since the pandemic, is insanely expensive
Yeah.
over to Europe. So we finally went ahead and pressed some copies in Europe, and now they're $19 to ship instead of $60 to ship a $60 book.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
But yes, folks, do check that stuff out, because at the very least, there's some musical shapes in there that will challenge you and maybe spur you on to other musical shapes. And I think that's the name of the game, right?
Yeah, yeah. And all of Bill's stuff is, Pruford's stuff is all transcribed.
Hmm. Yeah. So learn those parts. Get
Yeah,
out
learn
your
those parts and come back and talk to us in 20 years.
get your octobans out and get it straight, kid. You know. Um, well, Trey, what a ball! This
Yeah,
is
yeah,
really
this is
great,
great.
man.
I wasn't expecting it to be so fascinating.
Well, we're talking about fascinating music.
Yeah, yeah.
So, where can people find your stuff?
All of my stuff is at 7D Media as well, which is
Okay.
our little label, or you can go to my website, but I think it's more on 7dmedia.com, and
Right
a
on.
lot of collaborations and more to come.
Great. Trey Gunn, thanks so much for talking, everybody. Thanks for listening. We got into some pretty deep stuff. Hope you hung in there and enjoyed it. And this is the part where I can say, please hit us on Patreon, like and subscribe. We have so much more coming this year. It's a big year for the show in our 4th year.
Wow.
So, and you can always hit me with comments at bendianmusic.com. I'm always happy to hear from people, what their favorite stuff is and what they enjoyed. Once again, Trey Gunn, thank you.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks for having me.